So this lesson, we're going to be exploring the differences between the for in and the for of loops, different ways that you can do that, how you can loop through the arguments of a function. If you're using the arrow format, how you can loop through the arguments of the function, how you can use the for of to loop through an iterable object such as an array, how you can loop through the string, get all the letters from the string, and then using the for in, how you can iterate through the values of an object, and then also if you're using an array or a string, how you can use the value as the index value in order to return back the value of the item you're iterating through. So that's all coming up in this lesson. Using for of statement creates a way to loop over iterable items. So first off, let's go ahead and we're going to create an array. So this will give us a list of items that we can iterate over. So these are just going to be numbers all the way up to 5. And then we're going to use the for of loop in order to loop through those items. So going through the loop, setting up the value for the value that we're taking from the array, and then set the array name. And then we can use the value into the console. So that's going to output all of those values into the console, just updating my JavaScript code. So I'm linking it to the app2.js file, and we can see that those values now get output into the console. If you are updating the variable, you can use let in order to declare the variable. So this is different than what we would be doing with the for loop. So with a typical for loop, you'd be setting up the starting point, and then how you would end the loop, so the condition to end the loop, and then the incrementing in order to change the loop values. And then as you loop through, you're using the array, and the value that is iterating, so the value of I, would represent the index value. So that's going to output the same results, but using the for of is a much more efficient way to output those results, because it allows us to iterate over those values, and the variables within the values can be declared using let, or you can iterate over an array. If you want to update the value, you could take the value, and if you want to increment it by 1, this would give you an option to increment the value. I'm going to comment out that other loop. So this is one way to do it. If we're using const, of course, we're not able to change the value. So if you are not expecting to change the value, then you can use const. Otherwise, use let to make updates to the value as you iterate through them. You can also iterate over a string. So if you did have a string value, and I'll just use my first name for the string, we want to iterate over all of the string values. I'm going to comment out both of those console values, and we'll just use the for loop to iterate over those. So in order to get the letter and the string that we want to iterate through, this is a quick and easy way to get each one of the letters that's contained within the string. So we get an output like this. Every time it iterates over, it changes and moves to the next item. You can also iterate through arguments that are within a function. So if we set up an anonymous function and we invoke the function and passing in some values into that function, we want to output those values. So this is another place where we can use the let, and you can use the function keyword, or I'll also show you how you can do it with the arrow format. So using looping through and getting the value of the argument and from the arguments. And the arguments is the object that is passed into the JavaScript function. So this contains all of the arguments of the function. And then as we loop through, we can log out each one of those arguments. I'm going to just update this to be val, so it's a little bit shorter there. And it's just representing each one of the arguments as we loop through. So that will output the arguments. So if you were to add additional values within the arguments, and just simply log them all out. You can also use the arrow format as well. So that's another way that you can do that. And this is depending on if you want to use the newer format for the arrows. The arguments is not defined because we do need to pass the argument into the function using the 3 dots and then representing the arguments in order to create the array of arguments. So that way that can be used the same way that if you're using the function keyword, and that's going to output the same results. But you do need to include the 3 dots and then the arguments value. Otherwise, we're going to get an error that the arguments is not defined. And then this you can also call, you don't have to call it arguments. you can give it whatever name you want, and that's going to pass in the set of arguments into the variable, and that way you can loop through the for loop. The main difference between using the for of and the for in, so the for in is going to be used to iterate, so they're both used to iterate over something, and for in iterates over enumerable objects, whereas for of iterates over iterable objects. So most of the time you would be using the for of that had some values within the object. Let's try to loop through that first. So we'll take the value of the object and console log out what we get for value, and also comment out this console message. So we get that object is not iterable. So if we change this to let in, that allows us to loop through and get the property names of the items in the object. So similarly, we can't update this and ask to use for in to iterate through the values of the array, because what this is going to return back is that this is actually returning back the index values of the array. Let's also try the for in for the string value. And once again, it's going to return back the index value. So if you did want to see the value, you'd have to be looping through each one of those as you're incrementing. So it's returning back the index. So if we had string and then we referenced that as the index value, then once again we could return back those values. But it's a lot simpler just to do it with the of, because that's going to be returning back the values, whereas the in is essentially returning back the property names as well as the index values. So that's the main difference between the for in and for of, is that the for of is for iterable objects, whereas the for in statement iterates over enumerable properties of an object. So go ahead and try it out and try some of the different examples that we've presented in this lesson in regards to the for of, and you can also try the for in.